What's going on? It's your King of the Night, it's Valentine EX Turk with another Final Fantasy subject. And we're going to be talking about the subject known as the spin-off, the completion, the trilogy. So people understand, if you're not part of the Final Fantasy fan base or Final Fantasy community and you just get into Final Fantasy, this is a perfect video for you because you'll be running into a lot of this when you play Final Fantasy games. Now, what is a completion, you ask? Or should I say, what is a trilogy? A trilogy is a completion. That's what it's called in Final Fantasy terms. It's a completion. But many other people go back and forth on it. I'm going to call it a completion because it's originally what it is. And the very first completion that ever existed was actually Final Fantasy X. But it's not really a completion. Moreover, 10-2 is a direct sequel to Final Fantasy X. I mean, I guess it does kind of have its trilogy, because, I mean, trilogy meaning more, more than one, Okay, if anything else, think about the Star Wars movies. You got the prequels and the original trilogy, right? But when you put them all together, it's the complete trilogy. It's in that same context with Final Fantasy games. The games that are very known for having a big trilogy would be Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy XIII, and surprisingly, Final Fantasy 15. But how is Final Fantasy 15 the trilogy? Yeah, sure, they put all a trilogy worth of games into one game. But, again, the movies count, the OVAs count. Any source material Square Enix prints with the title of the game and the number of the game does count as part of the trilogy if it has Square Enix's logo slapped on there. That's why I made that one video where I said canon and non-canon. Like, fan novels are canon. Are not canon, sorry. Scratch that. Fan novels aren't canon, Like the NJ Gallagher. The Livestream.net is canon because Square Enix actually runs that. That's why I made that one video about what's canon and not canon. Anything that has Square Enix's label on it or seal of approval is canon. So that means OVAs and movies could count as it. Avid children can very well count for after Final Fantasy VII. It actually could fit. Now let's talk about the trilogies themselves. Starting with the very first games to even start a trilogy. And you might say, well, it might be Final Fantasy IV because they made the after years. But that was only in the PSP collection. They came with Final Fantasy IV and Final Fantasy, for the after years, okay? So we're not going to count that. I mean, it might be a Japanese release back in the day, but we're talking about Western releases in this type. So we're going to start with Final Fantasy X and X-2. Final Fantasy X-2 comes right after Final Fantasy X. At the ending where Tidus disappears. Now Yuna's on her own journey, trying to, I guess, collect spheres in order to bring back Tidus. When she runs into a man who looks like Tidus through the spheres, but this man is actually a bad guy and wants to use the weapon Vendagun to wipe out Spira. Now they have to stop him. After she stops him, Lynn, the previous incarnation of Yuna, comes out, and both Shurin, the man who looks like Tidus, and Lynn both go back to the far plane. Now, Shurin is actually the real version of Tidus, if you didn't really know. He was the real person that Tidus's dreams were based off. Tidus is a dream of the person named Shurin. And I've said in my fan theories that it's possible that Shurin is actually the true subject. Because, if you get this, Xanarkhan was 1,000 years old. Was 1,000 years ago. Shurin is 1,000 years. So he's actually an old man. Those really more of a spirit because he don't age now. That comes right after Final Fantasy X regular. You know why this is all significant? I mean, think about it. That's where the first trilogy has began. Now, several years later, the Final Fantasy VII, I don't know what anniversary. I think it might be the 20th anniversary for Final Fantasy VII specific. This is 2005. Advent Children came out, and then Advent Children was such a big hit and success that it spawned two other spin-offs. One prequel that we all know so well on the PSP that did well, known as Crisis Core, and even before that, the mobile game that Tetsuya Nomura worked on himself, known as Before Crisis, which I wish the project would be brought back up again. Even in the Final Fantasy VII remake, it was kind of a mini game. I'd like to have Before Crisis back again, so I'm still on that hype train for that. But Before Crisis, Crisis Core, you know, and then after the original Final Fantasy VII, after you complete the game of Final Fantasy VII, comes Advent Children. And then 3 years later, Vincent Valentine ends the whole entire Final Fantasy VII trilogy by defeating Shinra's last army, known as Deep Ground. Vincent Valentine saves the world and ends the Final Fantasy VII universe. So it goes like this: Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII, you know, Advent Children, and Dirge of Cerberus. Now they all have the Final Fantasy VII logo put on there because, again, that's how they do trilogies. They don't go through numbers. They'll just put, you know, what Square Enix will do was put the lettering on each thing. Now, Final Fantasy X-2 was the very first to get the extra number on that. You know, they were the first to get the extra number on that. Now, let's see, Final Fantasy VII just has the 7 on it with Square Enix's approval. Now let's jump ahead. Final Fantasy 13 has came out. Bad or good, Final Fantasy 13 was a mixed review game. There's people that are on the fanbase that liked the game, and there's people on the fanbase that absolutely hated the game. Either way, you know, gamers that don't really do Final Fantasy has picked it up so many times that they were able to make enough money to make sequels. This is where Final Fantasy 13-2 comes out, and Lightning's Return. Of course, Square Enix has a habit of actually opening the ending. Like, I don't know how to put this way. Put a cliffhanger on the ending. Such as when Fang and Vanille got turned into that ice sculpture after saving the planet. It was actually a cliffhanger for Final Fantasy 13-2. Because they come out of that at 13-2 somehow. You know. And then at the ending where Final Fantasy 13-2, after Sarah dies, there's an arc called Benevelza. And Benevelza is more directed to Final Fantasy 13 Lightning's Return, which is actually the third installment. They don't ever put 3, so there's only 13-2, and then the last game is Lightning's Return. They don't actually put a habit of putting the 3 on after they do the 2. But they always leave cliffhanger endings once they make enough money so they can make the next game. And this is where now you get into Final Fantasy Versus 13. You know, 10. And then you know that project's been canceled, redone, canceled, redone. Years later, Final Fantasy 15. Some of the Versus 13 stuff goes into the movie's King's Slave. Now to start off Final Fantasy 15, Platinum Demo would be the first game, because it's about Noctis' childhood, you know, and that dream he had after being attacked by the monster known as Molynith in Brotherhood. And then Brotherhood would be the next installment, because it's the backstory of each character of how they met, which puts a lot more backstory in the game. And then Kingsglaive, the events that take place before and in between the beginning of Final Fantasy 15. And then after that, Final Fantasy 15 ends it and wraps it all up. What I believe that what they did with Versus 13 is they cut it in parts, like Platinum Demo, Episode Dusade, even though Episode Dusade is one of the episodes in the game already. but episode do say Platinum Demo, Kingsglaive, and Final Fantasy 15 actually counts as the original Final Fantasy Versus 13, because original Versus 13 was supposed to be a long game, and Tabata didn't want to make a whole trilogy of it. So what he did is he cut in half by splitting it in between the things. So to start off Final Fantasy 15, Platinum Demo, Brotherhood, Episode do say, no, not Episode do say, sorry. So let me make the Platinum Demo, Brotherhood, Kingsglaive, Episode do say, and Final Fantasy 15 make up the 5 trilogy, 5 completion of Final Fantasy 15. So there's only a few games in the series that actually, now Final Fantasy 4 did that with the After Years and the PSP. So the only games that are truly trilogies is Final Fantasy 10 and 10-2, Final Fantasy Final Fantasy 7 Before Crisis, Final Fantasy 7 Crisis Core, Final Fantasy 7, Final Fantasy 7 Advent Children, Final Fantasy 7 Dirge of Cerberus, Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 13-2, Lightning's Return, Final Fantasy 13, Final Fantasy 4, Final Fantasy 4 The After Years, Final Fantasy 15, Platinum Demo, Final Fantasy 15 Brotherhood, Final Fantasy 15 what was that, Kingsglaive, Final Fantasy 15 Episode do say, Final Fantasy 15 Judgment Disc if you count the import, but we're not. So Final Fantasy 15 itself. So you get the point of what games are completions. Now there are other completions that don't really match title wise, like how tactics go into Final Fantasy 12, which is a big thing in the fan base, but it does. You gotta play Tactics first to understand 12 a little bit. But yes, Final Fantasy Tactics goes into Final Fantasy 12. It's an unspoken game that goes into the other. And yes, Dissidia technically does have a completion basis, but Dissidia is technically a fighting game. So there's always gonna be more games in that series, because, well, fighting games are always continuity. They continue all the time, just like your Street Fighters, your Tekkens, your Injustices, your Mortal Kombats. They're always going to make more and more and more and more, as long as it's making money, because fighting games you can never go wrong with. Fighting games are different than story-based games. Story-based games, that's why I said in my last video Final Fantasy 15 was never going to be able to make a sequel, because the way they ended it not only left the fans pissed off, but also it did put a permanent ending. There's no other way to answer unless they make an OVA to answer what happened after Chapter 13, which that's never going to happen. And let's just be honest, because Square Enix is going to be focused on Final Fantasy 7 Remake and Kingdom Hearts 3. Now, Kingdom Hearts 3 Kingdom Hearts series is technically a completion, but this channel is focused on Final Fantasy. So there you go. That's what this is. That's what a completion or a trilogy is on Final Fantasy. And may the crystal be with you.
Some say I get a little overboard with alcohol, taking it to the face to raise the blades for those that doubt it all. Telling me use a ball. I couldn't give a fuck, I'm on the bus, wrong neighborhood with the wrong outfit on.